if a human was consuming diet A, maybe a standard American diet versus a Mediterranean diet, you would expect those humans to look quite different after several months. So perhaps in retrospect, it's not that surprising that the same thing would happen to another mammal, a cow or a bison or even a monogastric like a chicken or a pig.
What I love about what you do at your lab and with all of your research that you do is you sort of take the nutrient profile of meat and food. And you almost, for me, you flipped it on its head because we're so obsessed with macronutrients and vitamins and minerals like, magnesium and potassium and protein, fat, and carbs. And, we're so we see food as just a list of nutrients. But what you do in your work is you kind of take the attention away from that and you focus on the finer details of food and how the nutrients and the compounds, how they interact together and create the food matrix, basically. So, my first question to you is, first of all, what led you to your work with food quality?
Well, I think it started probably during my PhD. We were doing some work on comparing whole eggs versus egg whites and looking at the muscle anabolic response. And at the time, the idea was is that you should eat egg whites after exercise instead of whole eggs because the fat would delay the digestion absorption and thus limit the rate at which you build muscle proteins afterwards. But somewhat to our surprise, we found that the whole eggs actually gave a stronger muscle anabolic response despite the amino acid digestion absorption being a little bit delayed. So we saw a peak in amino acid availability in the egg whites after about 60 minutes, and then in the whole eggs, it was about 90 to 120 minutes. So it was about yeah, half an hour or so to an hour delayed. But at the end of the 5 hour window, you still had a stronger muscle anabolic response to the whole egg. So, which we couldn't really fully explain by the logic at the time, which was thought that amino acids are the ultimate end all to determining the muscle anabolic response. But it was probably some of the bioactive compounds that are found within the egg yolk, because within the egg, most of the bioactive compounds are found within the egg yolk. So it could be things like it could be vitamins, it could be carotenoids, it could be things like choline. It could be other bioactive compounds that a lot of it would be considered secondary metabolites, or these are things that maybe the chicken eats a certain type of grain or forage, and those compounds get transformed within the animal, get incorporated into the eggs, and those can act as signaling molecules and can probably facilitate some of that muscle anabolic response. So that's where the first interest started. And then later on, as I progressed throughout my career, and I started this when I was at Duke University in the School of Medicine, we started to do work on how can you maybe improve those bioactive compounds. And the most obvious way to do that is what you feed a chicken, how you raise a cow, how you grow your crops. So that's how I kind of rolled into that field and got a real fascination for sort of what's now called the food matrix, or people sometimes call it the dark matter of nutrition. Basically, the stuff that does not appear in the nutrition facts panel, but makes up the other 99% of the food. So that's kind of how I rolled into it, and then yeah, started to build out that work over time.
Yeah, I have to admit, the food matrix, I had heard of it, but I had never delved into it in much detail. But since looking into your work, I've definitely looked into it more so. And it's fascinating how much there is to know about food than what is on a label. On labels, we just see a list of nutrients and we just take that as the food. So let's say if beef that is grass-fed versus beef that is grain-fed, if it says that they'll have the same amount of protein, same amount of fat, let's say, and that's how we would take it. We think, oh, then they must be the same then. So they must be the same food. But when you look at the food matrix and you do the studies that you've done, what you actually find is that they behave completely differently in the body. So for anybody who doesn't know about the food matrix, can you just go into what it is just quickly? Just what is it?
Yeah, it's well, as I said, it's probably the other 99%. We don't
Yeah,
really,
it's
I
a
wouldn't say
lot.
we have mapped out the food matrix, but for instance, beef contains an estimated 40,000 unique metabolites. So that is more than just the handful of nutrients, which is about 13 that regularly appear on nutrition facts panels, which is what 0.001% or something like that. So there's a lot of other compounds within the meat. This might be certain amino acid metabolites, peptides, certain lipid species. What we found was, especially in the context of grass-fed animals, when the animals are grazing biodiverse pastures that are rich in a variety of plants, that they accumulate or upcycle a lot of what would be considered compounds from medicinal plants or other plants that we cannot consume. They transform that into their bodies. Oftentimes turns it into mammalian versions of that because a cow is a mammal just like us. So we find that that is strongly impacted by what you feed the animal. And actually, when some of our metabolomics work that we did, metabolomics is a fancy way of saying the study of metabolites.
Hmm.
And metabolites in the context of plants or animals can serve as nutrients for themselves, but also for us when we eat them. And we found that there's about a 50% difference between grass-fed and grain-fed beef, mainly the result because their diet is obviously the day and night difference with the grass-fed animals, especially when they're on these biodiverse pastures, being able to select from a large number of plants versus maybe a total mixed ration, which is a lot of here in the US at least a lot of corn
Hmm.
with some hay and supplements. Obviously, those diets are really different. It's almost like if a human was consuming diet A, maybe a standard American diet versus a Mediterranean diet, you would expect those humans to look quite different after several months. So perhaps in retrospect, it's not that surprising that the same thing would happen to another mammal, a cow or a bison or even a monogastric like a chicken or a pig.
Yeah. I order meat. So I live in Grand Cayman. What we have decided to do, me and my husband, is we've decided to import meat from the US. So we use a wonderful farm, which I know you're familiar with, 1984 Farms,
Oh yeah.
Carissa. Um, they are absolutely fabulous. I love what she stands for, and I love that she lives and breathes quality on her farm. And I have to say, when we receive that box, we order in bulk. When we receive it and when we see all the meat that's there, we get so excited. And the taste and the texture of the meat is so different from what you would find in the supermarket. In terms of the food matrix and in terms of what you find, why is the flavor so different and why is the texture so different?
Yeah, I mean that's it's a good question. The flavor is related to what the animal eats
Mm,
to a large extent. Our physical activity can also play a role in that, but sort of the saying "you are what you eat"
mm,
that our grandmother told us is also true for another animal. So a lot of the flavor would reflect what the animal ate, but also, and this is sort of a little bit harder to put your finger on, but also the structural quality of the meat may be different because the animal has moved, right? One parallel I always like to draw is like within my lab, we'd also study athletes, for instance, endurance strength athletes, and then also you have people with that maybe are not the healthiest. They have, for instance, thinking of a study where we did, which is really on the other end of the spectrum, but chronic kidney disease patients, and we were taking muscle biopsies from both populations, so the healthy athletes and the chronic kidney disease patients. Even when you took a biopsy out of a healthy athlete, just the structural quality of that muscle was really high, whereas in the chronic kidney disease patient, it was just not that high of a quality, if that makes sense. And
mm,
so I'm not saying that's 100% explains things, but what the finding is made is that for instance, the myofibrillar proteins, the structural proteins, obviously when an animal is doing more physical activity, more exercise, it has some of that higher quality. Now, granted, how you age the meat plays a huge role in how tender that meat would be. So the aging is also important. But in terms of like, if we just look at it from a metabolic standpoint, when we profile the meat, then yeah, some of those structural proteins, those myofibrillary proteins, are enhanced. You see improvements in mitochondrial proteins. So the meat of animals out on pasture look a little bit more like a human athlete. So whether we consider that to be higher quality muscle, uh, generally we do in a human. So that might be some of explain some of the structural things, but the other, so it's really a combination, and it's the same in humans, right?
Right,
What makes us healthy is typically physical activity and diet.
right. That brings to mind, I was watching a lecture that you did online, and the term terroir, is it? That's when the
Yeah,
flavor. So,
terroir. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
can you just explain that? Because I found that fascinating.
Yeah, it's a term that is originally derived from the wine industry. So terroir means the territory, right? You taste the soil, you taste the environment. In the wine industry, it's thought to be much more than that, how you care for the grapes and things such as that. But in general, yeah, it would describe that you can taste the territory, meaning that if an animal here, let's say I'm in Utah and we have a lot of sagebrush, if the animal is consuming more sagebrush, you get a sage-like flavor, almost like marinating the meat from the inside out, right? Whereas maybe in another place where animals consume other types of forages or plants, it gets that unique flavor. So, and I think this is something that especially the French and the Italians have done really well, is well, they graze their animals through these alpine pastures. And make cheese out of it, right? And then you have cheese with that you can taste that territory. And we know from profiling, at least here, meat and milk in the U.S., but we obviously compare our data to maybe historic French and Italian data as well. Is that these upland pastures, these mountain pastures, and you can certainly also achieve that on a biodiverse pastures in lowland, but mountain pastures are typically very biodiverse and have plants uh, on them that need to be pretty hardy if you wanted to survive on a mountain where it's cold and it's super sunny and it's not, maybe it's sometimes not a lot of rain. You get this incredible amount of phytochemical diversity or phytochemical richness, and then the animal consuming those plants actually incorporates those compounds and usually metabolized versions of that within their meat and milk. These are things like flavonoid-derived metabolites and other polyphenols, and we can taste those nuances, those subtleties within the meat and milk. So it's in many ways it's yeah, tasting the soil and the land.
And just to hammer the point home, you also mentioned in the lecture, which I found really fascinating, in one of the samples that you took, you could see the compound for the color purple in the meat. And that really hammered home how literally what the cow ate is what came out in the meat. What
Yeah.
was that again?
Well, these are cyanidin-derived compounds. So these are things that people maybe know the word anthocyanidin, which are found in blueberries, right? And give the blueberries their blue and purple distinct color. But what we've also observed is that cows and also other animals I would argue actually lamb and goat is richer in these compounds because of the way that they forage. They consume more shrubs and forbs and flowers. But yeah, if they're consuming purple flowers
Hmm.
within that is found on some of these pastures, and they eat the grasses, and obviously they ingest those as well. Yeah, you can find metabolites of those. And I actually got very interested in this as well. And it was through talking to a hunter on this, and he said that when he would hunt bear, black bear, in the after the berry season, the meat would actually be purple and kind of has that blueberry flavor to it. So, and that's an extreme scenario because it's the bear gorging on blueberries, right?
Right.
But it's initially when we found it, I was like, this cannot be right. And then I dug a little deeper and talked to some people, and it was like, well, that was probably empirically the strongest evidence that if you harvest a bear that has eaten a lot of blueberries, that the meat would actually have this blueberry hint and color to it. So that's really interesting. You get that to an extent also in cows. So yeah, we sometimes find like weird stuff that we think is weird, and initially we would question like, well, there's no way this is here, and we would have to rerun the sample and find, see a clear peak again. We've gotten to the point where I do start to believe it, because initially I was like, well, when we process this, did someone eat blueberries and not wash their hands or something like that, right? But obviously that wasn't the case, and we use gloves as well. So but you get my point, is
Yeah,
that yeah, you
totally.
get some of
Yeah.
these unique findings that are hard to believe, and then yeah, maybe. But that's also because we didn't really know about those compounds, right? And that they could appear, because historically we've really focused on amino acids and vitamins and minerals. And then if you start to look at broader arrays of
Mm.
compounds, then yeah, there's there's been quite a few surprising findings along the way.
I mean, this is an example of how people will actually start to look at their meat differently and the quality of the meat and where the meat actually comes from. I think so many of us go to the supermarket and we just blindly pick up any beef or any pork or any chicken, and we don't consider where it's come from. But I think talking to you really brings to light how important it is to actually know where the meat came from and what sort of diet it would have had, and how active it was. So, with that in mind, from your research, you found that not all meat is created equal, obviously. So, can you first define some terms for us? What does grain-fed, grass-fed, and pasture-raised, what do they mean?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of grass fed, the technical definition is 100% grass fed. Pasture raised or pasture finished implies they were finished out on pasture. The term is mainly used for chicken and pork and other animals that would still eat some grain out on pasture, or actually quite a bit. I mean, the modern chicken breeds and uh, pork, or the pigs that we mainly raise. I'm not saying it's impossible, but a lot of farmers would feed them grains as well, just because it it helps them put on weight, but
Hmm.
also because of the modern breeds, they almost need that grain to be really productive,
Okay.
right? Because you got to balance obviously economics with maybe if you have a chicken that can only consume forages, or can do eating bugs and eating foraging around, possible. Probably not the breeds that we're constantly using, but they also end up with like something that's the size of a quill, right?
Hmm.
So those are usually, and I don't know if you ever ate quill, but uh, an entire quill, a few bites, and it's over. So
Yeah, it is.
yeah,
That's why I never eat it.
yeah, so that's one of. I was in Texas the other day, and I was at a restaurant, and they had quail. It was the first time I ate it, so it was quite good. But um, so that's one thing. So pasture finish means finished out on pasture, and then grain fed is typically a term for used for animals that are fed within what's called CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, where
Mm.
they are fed a diet that is typically formulated to put on weight quite fast, because we were real reward farmers typically, not just in the animal industry, but also in crops by yield, right? By
Mm.
amount of food that is produced per paid per pound of meat. So, and they're fed usually diets that are very high in grains.
Mm.
In cattle, can go up to 70, 80% or so, and corn would be a major portion of that, especially here in the US where it's readily available. Um, so in that case, because and the rest would be made up usually with what's called roughage. It would be hay. It would be also certain vitamins and minerals, because it's to make up for that lack of that potentially, and because
Mm.
it's a much more narrow diet. Over time, though, an interesting sidebar is that we've worked with farmers, especially well, technically, yeah, I call them grass-fed producers, but they are pasture-finished beef producers that might, put some. I'm thinking of one, for instance, in California that we worked with, and what they would do is they would get distiller's grain from a local microbrewery that is using high-quality grains, and put that out on pasture, and then the animal has free choice access just to graze, but it can also go to that feed bunk to eat some distillers grains.
Mhm.
And in that case, you get something really interesting because grains, they do contain high amounts of B vitamins. They do have energy, right? And we actually find that grain-fed beef on average contains a little bit more B vitamins, actually. All the other nutrients tend to be a little bit lower. But is that, this is a great way of upcycling grain byproducts, or what some farmers do is that they may graze some spent crop fields where people grow wheat or oats or barley or soy or corn and have the animals graze that. So the idea of having the animal consume some byproduct or some grain is maybe not the worst thing, and it might actually be beneficial. But what
Mm.
I think what we did was in sort of feedlot industry, we took something that may have some benefits, and then we took it to the extreme, maybe a little bit for yeah, economic reasons, and from that perspective, it makes total sense. It's not per se to cast blame on anyone in that regard, but it does. Uh, uh, what we do find is that it's not in the best interest of the health of the animal. Their
Mm.
metabolic health definitely is decreased, and then also because they don't have that incredible diversity in nutrients, right? Because they're getting maybe three, four, five products instead of being able to select from 50 different plants.
Mm.
You get a less complex meat that has
Mhm.
also is typically not as rich in these bioactive compounds. So and also over time I've definitely come to believe that the health of the animal and its nutrient density profile, if it's meat and milk, you're probably looking at the same thing there.
Right. So just so I can clear up a few things in my head. So when you say pasture raised and grass fed, can that be the same thing or are they different?
No, they can be the same
They can
thing.
be the
They're
same
typically,
thing.
yeah, they're
But
used
yeah,
interchangeably, yeah. But
yeah,
but
but
typically, yeah, grass fat. So what the American Grass Fat Association and also other organizations consider, it has to be, animal has to be 100% grass fat.
right.
So during when there's not the grazing season, it needs to be fed hay. So it basically
Mm.
cannot be fed any grain ever.
Right. Okay. And so, just so that it's clear, pasture raised and grass fed, they're considered the best types to be eating. Whereas grain fed, I know you said there's some crossover there, but grain fed is usually considered to be the lower quality meat, basically. That's what I'm kind of gathering from
Yeah,
this.
typically it's feedlot finished, and that's probably where what is, and obviously that's not how it's designated on the package. It's usually just
Mm.
called beef,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, pasture finished. I mean, for beef, it's usually used grass fed, but like I said, we've worked with some producers that pasture finished with a little bit of grain, and actually does look similar to grass fed beef. Like
Okay.
they're indistinguishable from it. We cannot tell from the data, and we only tested a few grass-fed samples that would clearly register as grain-fed beef based on the
Mm.
data. And it turned out that the supplier, or at least the company that was sourcing that, was suspecting foul play, and that they were buying grass-fed beef, but they thought it was really grain-fed beef. And obviously, we can't stick our hand in the fire for it, but especially when we look at these broader nutrient profiles, I want to say that our models can fairly accurately or very accurately predict whether the animal is grass fed or grain
Mm.
fed.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, anybody who's listening to this, they'll think, okay, so uh, that's great for the animal, but what's in it for me? I mean, usually grass-fed or pasture-raised or regeneratively raised meat is usually more expensive and harder to source for some people, depending on where they live. You've done a lot of research in the years, but you recently conducted a 4-month study on the links between animal health and then how that impacts human health. And I believe that that was this year you did this
Yeah,
study.
that's right.
So what have been your biggest findings in relation to grass-fed, corn, grain-fed meats, and then human health? And does it even matter?
Yeah, it does matter, or at least based on the data that we have so far. So the hypothesis that we wanted to test was, and what we started with, is that um, the question was, can eating pasture finished beef, pork, and chicken and eggs, can that raise the omega-3 levels in our blood? Because there's always a lot of discussion, especially on social media, where people would say, well, who cares that the omega-3s in grass-fed beef are a little bit higher because it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's so minor. Um, and people obviously compare it to salmon quite often. And on paper, compared to salmon, yes, it is a lot less. And
Mm.
it probably is a good idea to eat fish regularly as well. But in a real world scenario, people eat beef, chicken, pork, and eggs quite often. So if you're able to move the needle on the omega-3 status of people by those commonly consumed foods, we believe that could be a good thing. And there have been a lot of trials, especially done in the UK, as well as Australia, that would suggest that yes, eating grass-fed lamb or eating grass-fed beef or eating pastured poultry can raise the omega-3s in the blood. So, but the studies were usually a little bit smaller scale, a little shorter. So we wanted to replicate the study and then give them everything. So we gave them beef, we gave them pork, we gave them chicken, we gave them eggs. And what we found is actually that the omega-6 to 3 ratio in the red blood cells of people, on average, it was in the conventional group, it was about 5, the omega-6 to 3 ratio. We were able to bring that down to 2.
Mm.
Uh, and it was the result of raising the omega-3s or almost doubling the omega-3s in the red blood cells. So we would measure this in the red blood cells, in the membrane of red blood cells. The red blood cell, they turn over after about 90 to 120 days. So that's the reason why we measured it there. And typically, omega-3s, they have a whole range of health benefits. They can, over time, protect us from heart disease, from Alzheimer's, from cancer. I mean, pick your favorite disease, and typically omega-3s play a role in that. And one of the issues is that we're not consuming enough of this. I mean, the reason why people have high omega-6 to 3 ratios in their blood is because mainly because we're not consuming omega-3s. We're also consuming a lot of ultra-processed foods that have a lot of seed oils or high omega-6 oils in them. That's certainly part of it. But probably I would argue the bigger issue is that we're not consuming enough omega-3s because the meats that we consume do not contain a lot of omega-3s. And we also typically do not consume a lot of fish. Maybe it's different in the Cayman Islands, but
No, it's not actually.
it's not
We
okay.
don't consume enough.
Okay, yeah, well, definitely here in landlocked states, it's not that common at all. So, um, so what we found in that study is that you can actually meaningfully raise the omega-3s in your blood. You can almost double them by just eating animal source foods. Pork, chicken, beef, and eggs. And in that study, we didn't have fish in there because we want to isolate the effects of land-based animal source foods. And I would certainly also argue it's a good idea to eat fish regularly. But it also tells you that animal source foods, land animal source foods, can raise the omega-3s. And I think that's important information because I get pushback on this quite often as well, where people say, well, Stefan, who cares about grass-fed beef? And
Mm.
now the omega-3s went from like 20 to 60 or something like that, or 30 to 70, because it's still only a tenth of what's found in salmon.
Mm.
But
It's the quantity
here's
that matters that
it's the
people
quality.
eat.
Yes, well,
Yeah.
I think the whole food matrix is actually what matters because
Mm.
that's where it becomes interesting. Because I would also argue that if I gave you 80 milligrams of omega-3s in a pill, it would not be very effective.
No.
But it seems like when you get this in the whole food matrix, that you probably have, we know that phytonutrients, those plant compounds, they act as antioxidants. So you're probably protecting, maybe within your gut or within the product, you're protecting these omega-3s from getting oxidized. I think that's what's happening
Mm.
because of these powerful antioxidants that also come with the green forages and those plants that the animals consume. And then also there's probably other unidentified cofactors that actually can help with the uptake of omega-3. So you get more bang for your buck. You basically get a stronger effect than what you can determine from an Excel spreadsheet or a nutrition facts panel. And we know this, for instance, from eggs. If you get vitamin D through eggs, it raises your vitamin D levels about 5 times higher than what you would get from a pill. So, and again, it's probably because of some of these other cofactors that are within the eggs, coming back to the food matrix, that if you get these compounds from foods versus supplements, the effects tends to be a lot stronger.
So basically, what you're saying is, even though the omega-3 is found in grass-fed animals, even though it's considerably less than some other fish, let's say, you're still though getting it's like highly absorbable. It's very usable by the body, especially if they're grass-fed, pasture-raised, because of the food matrix in the muscle of the animal. Like it's the way that it helps you digest it better and helps preserve the omegas better, and you can basically use it better.
Yeah, that's what we think is going on. Yeah, that's
Mm,
very likely. And I'm certainly would say that in terms of mapping out the food matrix, we've probably, we're probably still at the tip of the iceberg, even though
mm,
our understanding has increased a lot and we're able to measure over 1,000 compounds. Like I said, beef contains an estimated 30 to 40,000 metabolites. So we're still quite a ways off from mapping it all out. But if in the past people were measuring 50, 60, 70 compounds and that's been raised to 1,000, right? You've 10x your knowledge on the compounds within food. Um, and so I think that's what's going on, and
mm,
we found a very strong effect there in that study for 4 months by just consuming pasture finished meat and eggs, um, and found quite strong improvements in the omega threes. Now, granted that it's omega three status is per se not a health outcome, right? We did find that especially amongst the women their VLDL cholesterol, so very low density lipoprotein cholesterol, actually decreased
okay.
as a result. So that is also a strong risk factor for heart disease in the future. Granted, in a 4 month trial, no one develops heart disease, and
Mm.
if so, I would have a lot of explaining to do, probably to an IRB. But obviously, if this behavior is repeated for 30 years, right? After 30 years, in theory, you should have lower risk of heart disease, lower risk of Alzheimer's, lower risk of cancer because you have a better omega-3 status. And
Mm.
certainly the whole diet matters, right? It's if you're eating a standard American diet and you're switching out your grain-fed beef for grass-fed beef, while that depending on how it's raised, could have certain environmental benefits and it would have some nutritional benefits for sure. But it is bigger picture, right? If you're eating a bunch of junk food, but with grass-fed beef patties, you're
Mm.
probably not gonna have the maximum health. But it's just one piece of the puzzle by which we can increase our diet quality and increase the number of compounds within our body that are beneficial for our health long term.
That's what I love about the study. At the end, you kind of conclude that, but the bigger picture is that the whole diet matters. So you can't just switch to more expensive kind of meat and expect to have health changes if you're eating a standard American diet, or let's say, I'm from the UK, and they're heavily processed diet as well. So the whole picture matters. But basically, if you're on a whole foods diet and you make the switch to grass-fed and regeneratively raised, pasture-raised, all those different terms, then it will make a difference to your health long term. Long
Yeah, that's
term.
that's right. And you may see some differences or some benefits when you're consuming a standard American diet, but the
Mm,
other stuff is so bad for you that the
right.
you're not really maximizing your health because we did find that even if we look at some of those nuances of single foods and it's perhaps or in this case food groups, right, or animal sourced foods, um, the just not consuming a standard American diet. We've done studies like that as well, where we gave people a bunch of ultra processed foods, mimicking a standard American diet, gave them a whole foods diet. Just not consuming a standard American diet is by far the biggest impact.
So
So,
that's
and
that's basically, like, all of this aside, really just don't eat a standard American diet, basically. That's number
yeah,
one.
that's right. That's
Right.
number one. It should be on top. Yeah,
Yeah.
but when you get to the nuances of changing behavior, right? If you get foods and in this case we talking about animal source foods that taste more complex, that taste better,
Mm,
that taste richer. Um, that could be a way of getting people to eat those foods. And then
mm,
we also do a lot of profiling on crops. If you have carrots that are grown regeneratively that actually taste like a carrot instead of water with a
yeah.
sort of aftertaste of carrot, right?
Mm,
Is that you can probably get children or adults to eat those crops more readily, and you can quote unquote compete with
mm,
ultra processed foods on flavor because you have crops and you have animal source foods that have uh, a stronger and complexer flavor. That's because I think especially in the context of fruits and vegetables, we can taste this quite often, right? Like carrot
Mm.
that really tastes like this deep flavor, or a tomato that is
Yes.
fresh and that has like a deep tomato flavor that's actually, you can pop them like candy, as opposed to
Mm.
maybe something that is hard and watery and doesn't really have a pleasant flavor. So that's also a way of getting people to eat more whole foods. And I think that's
Mm.
something that we are starting to learn and are starting to see that these phytonutrients, these flavonoids, and in tomatoes it might be lycopene or other carotenoids, also in carrots that give that flavor. If you're able to enhance those through your growing practices, it also improves the uptake of people because they become tastier to eat.
Mm. Just kind of backtracking to omega-6 and 3 ratios, I saw in your work how pork, so conventionally raised pork on corn, on soy, let's say, the omega-6 to 3 ratio is the highest out of all of the meats. I think it's like 30 when it should be like, the better meats are like 2 or something like that. And it's for that reason that I tend to avoid conventionally raised pork. So when I go into the supermarket here, I won't buy pork. I'll probably buy beef if I need to, but when it comes to pork, I'll tend to not touch it when it comes to supermarkets. Um, are there any conventional meats that we should be avoiding more than others? Would you agree on the pork, or do you think I'm missing a beat somewhere?
No, well, if you look at it strictly from the omega-6 to 3 ratio, where a lower ratio is typically considered better, and
Yes.
mainly because how can you alter that ratio? Mainly the ratio is typically altered because you're increasing the omega-3s. Um, so when you're in the context of pork, it's also monogastric. So that I would say in a ruminant,
Hmm.
you have a little bit more of a safety net, I would say. So
Interesting. How
yeah.
so?
Well, it's a four-stomached animal, and but yeah, so you get a lot of more metabolism within
Hmm.
the
Okay.
in the ruminant versus a monogastric. Whereas with a monogastric, you typically we're also monogastrics, right? So the statement "you are what you eat" is more true in a monogastric
Right.
versus a ruminant, where you have the microbes that transform some of those compounds, and you have a little bit of I would say, like, maybe the way of saying is there's a little more forgiveness in that.
Hmm.
Another part of it also is that in terms of feedlot finished animals, they're still on grass for a while. So you might have them in a feedlot for the last 4 months, but you still get some of the legacy effect from being out on pasture. But with chicken and pigs, they might be born in confinement and
Right.
fat, grain heavy diets really from an early age onwards. Um, so, and also being a monogastric,
Hmm.
their tissues reflect what they eat a lot more. So you can indeed see in pigs is that, yeah, you might have an omega-6 to 3 ratio of 30 is what we found. Granted that in pastured pork, probably some of the lowest we've seen is about 4 to 5 or so.
Oh.
You don't really get it to grass-fed beef levels. As a comparison, grain-fed beef is about 10 to 1 or 8 to 1. So still, and our diet is about 15 to 1. The
Hmm.
standard American or standard Western diet, I should say, is about 15 to 1. So even if you eat grain-fed beef, you're still better than that. But um, basically, what we see is that producers of pork and chicken, if they start to incorporate omega-3 rich feeds, such as maybe flax, such as some peas, such as fish meal is also something that people you don't want to go too heavy on, but maybe at like 5% or so, then you're consuming you get a lot of omega-3s also enriched in the pork, but also flax. And then if you pull back on omega-6 rich feed like soy or corn, you can actually move the needle quite a bit. And you can, so typically the omega-6 to 3 ratio in monogastrics, porks and chicken is the spread is much wider than you would be able to achieve in beef, where, and we've even tested some chicken that had an omega-6 to 3 ratio of 1 to 1, but the farmer was an Amish farmer, was feeding, uh,
I think I know who you're referring to there.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
Amos?
It's yeah, Miller's Biofarm is
Right,
the brand
yes.
that they're selling under. That's right. And they were feeding and they actually were we actually ended up buying their eggs for the study
Mm,
to do the feeding trial because it was also one of the best eggs that we ever tested. But yeah, they are basically feeding barley, peas, oats, flax meal. I'm not sure if they still feed flax, but fish meal, and so those resulted in very low omega 6 to 3 ratios.
mm,
So obviously the feed is more expensive, but if you have a consumer that's willing to pay for that, then it might be economical for the farmer. And we've seen this in multiple farmers that are able, if you're able to pull back a little bit on the corn and soy and add some flax, add some other protein-rich sources such as legumes,
mm,
like peas, you can actually move the needle quite a bit, and you have a lot more opportunity to improve it in monogastrics such as pork and chicken, whereas in beef, you still have a little bit of being ruminant
mm.
animal. You still have a little bit of forgiveness.
Okay. So just out of curiosity, what's your attitude to buying meat? Do you buy it from the supermarket? Do you make sure you get the best quality? And what's your diet like in general? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, so we I usually buy my meats indeed from local farmers.
Mm.
And a lot of it would be pasture finished or grass fed meats, and we also have. I grew up drinking milk directly from the farm. So here in
Mm.
Utah, 3 blocks away, there's a little goat farm that I get my milk from that I drink. So a lot of it I try to source locally whenever possible, and uh, also oftentimes go to farmers markets when we were having a little CSA here as well that I get my produce from in the summer. Now, granted, I'm in Utah, so we have a
Mm.
short growing season here, usually only about 4 to 5 months. But yeah, my diet is mostly whole foods, so
Yeah.
it's an omnivorous diet. I eat a good amount of meat, milk, and eggs, and also fish. I'm from Europe, so the old world remedy to everything is taking a tablespoon of cod liver oil in the morning.
Yes.
So I always do that, and I actually got my wife to do it as well over time. Um, but yeah, just 3 meals a day. And this morning, for instance, I had some blood sausage, which actually is a British.
Yes.
I live in
You
the
mean black pudding?
yeah, black pudding. That's right.
Yes. Yeah. I love that.
So yeah, I had that with some eggs, and then I had some greens, and I had some peppers and onions and some potatoes, and my lunch will also be whole foods again. And
Mm.
so yeah, it's a very heavy whole foods based diet. And then on days that I exercise, I tend to increase my carb intake a little bit more. And then on days that I don't exercise, I tend to substitute some of those carbs with a little more fat to get some more fat soluble nutrients in. So pretty basic, but yeah, it doesn't have to be complicated.
Yeah, I'd say mine is similar, just whole foods diet. Like I said to you before, I've experimented with carnivore and keto and all of those things, but I've basically landed on, I eat a lot of animal protein. So every day I make sure that I eat some eggs or meat, and then for me it's whole foods as well. So I eat a lot of rice, and then I'll eat vegetables and fruits and things like that. But when I was doing my carnivore stint, I really got into the community. Because I was really interested and fascinating in the benefits of it for some people who had autoimmune conditions. I just found it fascinating. And it also enhanced my passion for meat and therefore meat quality, because if you're eating so much meat, then obviously quality starts to matter. But the carnivore community, some of the bigger speakers, they say that any meat quality is better than not having it at all. So it doesn't, that the quality doesn't matter. You just got to get the meat in. Do you agree with this? And in what ways could low quality meat quietly sabotage health over time, if it does?
Yeah, I mean, it also always depends on what you compare it to. If you compare it to a
Mm.
standard American diet, it being so poor, right? And
I
then
think
if
that's
you,
what they mean. Yeah,
yeah,
that's probably
maybe. I
why they're
mean,
saying just eat meat, like, and you're already doing better than you
yeah, if you
likely
compare
were.
it, yeah, yeah. I mean, I would agree with the sense that if you're comparing it to Twinkies or something like that, or ultra
Mm,
processed, refined products, candy bars,
that's
then yes,
true.
eating grain-fed beef. And this is also what we found, to be honest with you, is that we've done several trials where we did, for instance, also did a trial where people were just habitually consuming a standard American diet. Then we gave them a whole foods diet that was sourced from conventional agriculture. So it would be just your regular produce in the grocery store, right? That is usually produced in more monoculture farms, right? Treated
Mm.
with pesticides, etc. Then we also, as part of that diet, all their animal source foods came just from grain-fed sources. And then we sourced the diet from regenerative agriculture. Now, while we found some subtleties, mainly in food quality, on the regenerative side being higher, especially in some phytonutrients and things like fat-soluble vitamins, the just not eating the standard American diet made people way healthier. Their LDL dropped, their triglycerides dropped, their HbA1c dropped. So even if you're within a carnivore community, if you are eating a standard American diet, you're going to eat then feedlot finished meat. Your caloric intake is going to be lower. So just by
Mm.
losing weight, your blood markers will improve. Um, by not eating a bunch of ultra processed foods, your blood markers will improve. So it kind of depends on where you're coming
Mm.
from. Now,
Mm.
I could see a scenario where maybe we flip it on its head. And let's say you were on a carnivore diet, you've only been eating grass-fed meat, very high quality. My guess is if you switch over to eating feedlot finished meat, your omega-6 to 3 ratio would go up, right? You would have more
Right.
omega-6s in your blood, less omega-3s in your blood. Would it alter your triglyceride levels? I'm not sure.
Mm.
We do see a further improvement in VLDL cholesterol with eating pasture finished meat. But yeah, it might be an interesting. I'm sure on a forum you can find someone who did that, consume a uh, but yeah, I would expect your blood work would look different for sure. Like especially your omega-3s would look different, and maybe some of those broader nutrient profiles, those phytonutrient derived metabolites will look slightly different. Um, how this would play out over 30 years, I don't know. I mean, I would argue that if you have a better omega-3 status over a 30-year span, right? Because that's usually when by the time you're 50, 60, kind of you really start to uh, get some of those health issues to occur. Your cholesterol, maybe LDL cholesterol might be
Mm.
creeping up, your triglycerides might be creeping up. It could matter over
It
time,
could
yeah. So
matter.
it depends on where you're coming from, I guess. But yeah, I'm pretty certain that because we saw this already here, people were consuming an omnivorous diet, but based on if they eat grain-fed meat or grass-fed meat, their blood work would look different. Their
Mm.
omega-3s look way different, and their VLDL cholesterol in the women. And the reason why we think it was in the women is because we still gave them a lot of meat as well, but they were just smaller than the men. That's the nature of it. So they were
Mm.
proportionally probably eating a little bit more meat. So that's I think why we saw the effect in the women a little bit stronger.
That's interesting. So when you see on the news that red meat causes heart disease, let's say, what goes through your mind when you read something like that?
To my mind goes that what they're meaning is that eating red meat as part of a standard Western or
Right.
American diet
Yes.
causes heart disease. That's what I read. I just fill in
Yeah.
that sentence
Yeah.
myself,
Yeah.
basically. But no, that's what a lot of the data would suggest. So a lot of the data suggests that and these are epidemiological studies. So you would link red meat intake to heart disease. And people that eat more red meat tend to have higher risk of heart disease. But then if you dig deeper into what kind of diets are, people that consume high amounts of red meat on average are also consuming a standard American diet. There's not a lot of people like you and me that eat red meat as part of a very healthy diet, but you can find studies like that. And also when you start to account statistically for fruit and vegetable intake, for alcohol intake, for smoking, for you name it, a bunch of other risk factors, this association of red meat with heart disease always goes down and
Mm.
oftentimes becomes neutral. And there's also really interesting studies in specifically within North African or Middle Eastern populations where even processed meat is associated with a decreased risk. Why? Because they're eating their processed meat is with cured meat with spices and
Mm.
herbs and um, using time-honored traditions to produce these, right? And usually it also means you're consuming this as part of a high status diet. You're probably consuming a bunch of other things. But my point being is that if you eat red meat as part of a healthy diet, those associations usually disappear. And in the randomized controlled trials, where in studies where red meat is fed alongside a DASH diet, alongside a Mediterranean diet, or Bold diet, or another whole foods based diet, you typically see that the effects are neutral or health improving.
Hmm.
So when I
So it
see those
depends what you eat
headlines,
it with. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's a fairly simple explanation is that if you eat red meat as part of a standard American diet, then yeah, maybe detrimental. And there's actually some mechanism behind it because if you eat red meat, especially if like grilled red meat or cooked at high heat, you do have some formation of advanced glycation end products or other um, potentially carcinogenic compounds. But what you find is that in digestion models where you simulate digestion basically in a lab, if you marinate the meat or add broccoli with it or some other plant compounds or rosemary, you actually the formation of those compounds decrease by 50%, 60%, 70%. So actually eating meat as part of a whole foods diet, rich in fruits and vegetables, you might get the good of the red meat while limiting some compounds that may be detrimental. So that comes back to this idea of consuming an omnivorous diet. And some people will challenge that and, of course, say, oh, well, the amount of advanced glycation end products you get from meat are not enough to really cause those issues. I'm not sure it could, that could be the case. Um, but you do see a decrease in that. And plus, I would argue, if I just look at it from a human nutrition standpoint, to me, knowing the nutrients that are found in plant foods and in animal source foods, to me, it doesn't make any sense to exclude either.
Right. Okay. So carnivore diet isn't something you'd recommend then?
And well, I mean, I'm not arguing. No, I wouldn't recommend it. No,
You just
no.
wouldn't
But
recommend it, yeah.
but I would also say if people feel that they have a benefit from that, and especially I
Mm.
could see, I mean, we also cannot ignore people's experiences, right? But I would say if you have strong autoimmune issues, and for you some, even eating some broccoli or something like that, I mean, typically if you eat things maybe like sauerkraut or something like that that are fermented and things such as that, you should be able to, I think most people should be able to handle that. But if you're not able to handle that, then yeah, fix that. But I would, once you get your gut issues under control, try to slowly increase easily digestible plant foods just because of the nutrients that you're getting from those plant foods are typically not found in animal source foods, and the nutrients that you get in animal source foods to an extent are not found in plant source foods. So you actually get much more of a diverse array of nutrients. So yeah, and unless you know some, I mean, I'm not a registered dietitian, so I cannot give advice officially to anyone anyway. But I would say that, yeah, in general, for most of the population, you would do well on a spectrum of omnivory and diets that are rich in whole foods. And whether that means you're consuming 70% plant foods and 30% animal foods, or you're 50-50 in terms of calories, that's kind of for people to figure out what they feel
Mm.
best on. But I think I would not recommend a pure vegan diet or a pure carnivore diet to the vast majority of the population, at least from a nutritional standpoint.
Mm. And that's perfect because the next question was, what are your views on plant-based diets?
Yeah, I mean,
I
well,
suppose it's a
if it's a,
similar response,
yeah, well,
right?
if it's a plant-based diet, I'm all in favor of. But usually when people talk about plant-based diets, they mean plant-exclusive diets, right?
Exclusively, like
Yeah.
vegan.
Because if you're consuming eggs and dairy, I
Mm.
think you'll be perfectly fine. You'll um, you should be able to get the vast majority of your nutrients in, and especially if you then select some plant foods that are
Mhm.
rich in iron and zinc, I think you'll be completely fine. But if you exclude all animal sourced foods, then yeah, I mean, I can I can respect when people do that, obviously for moral reasons, but from a nutritional perspective, I don't think it's the just what we know about nutrients and their health impacts, even things like taurine,
Mm.
anserine, creatine. cysteamine, maybe sort of the dark matter of nutrition, probably nutrients that no one has ever heard about, but we do know that they are important for our cognitive function, and we know that they're only found in animal source food. So, and I would also make the argument is that maybe even in your lifetime, let's say if you become vegan when you're 20, after your early developmental stages, and you stay that throughout your life, maybe it doesn't even show up in the next generation. Maybe,
Hmm.
it could be that's also what I'm interested in. What are the multi-generational effects? Let's say in the hypothetical experience, we would all go vegan, right?
Hmm.
It might not show up in our lifetime. For some people, it definitely would, right? You get nutrient
Right.
deficiencies, but it might be like multi-generational because I think part of also we know that some of these compounds like DHA, right, docosahexaenoic acid, the omega-3, it's so important for our brain health. But once we're fully developed, could we? Do I think it's ideal to never consume it? No. But once you do that in adulthood, are you gonna die? No. But if we did that over time, over generation, probably we'd have less DHA in our brain over time, and we should. I don't know. Would our IQ drop?
Yeah.
Would we get less smart? Potentially, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
these are all hypothetical, but just if I just look at the what we know about the nutrients in plant source foods and the nutrients in animal source foods and their unique health benefits that they get that you might not, and you might not find them in the plant foods or the animal source foods, to me, it doesn't make any sense to exclude either from a pure nutritional standpoint. If it's other moral, that's someone's choice, right? But nutritionally speaking, I don't think it's the best thing to do.
Women are told to train their muscles for longevity and for anti-aging reasons. And it's very much in the headlines these days, strength training, get strong, ladies, that sort of thing. You did your PhD on muscle and protein metabolism. So I'm very much into strength training myself, and I love the idea of muscles and meat and things like that. So when I saw you did your PhD on protein metabolism, that was like, wow, that's really fascinating. I just wanted to know what were your biggest findings on that?
So the biggest finding, well, we did a lot of work in whole foods at that
Mm,
time because most of the work had been done on protein supplements. So the biggest finding really of that work is when we studied beef, we studied milk, we studied eggs, is that whole foods um, can provide benefits, what we believe, beyond just their amino acid or protein content.
mm,
So really some of those bioactive compounds. So one of the main findings there, or one of the main recommendations based on that work, would be that you do a food first approach. So
right.
while supplements can have their place, getting protein from foods as much as possible is probably the best way to go. And then supplements provide a level of convenience, of course, but whole foods should be the center and front because of all the other compounds that you get that can also impact protein synthesis beyond just the protein content of that food.
So, from an exercise and muscle point of view, would there be any changes switching from average protein sources, whole food sources, to high quality meat? So, we've talked about the omega-3 to 6 ratios and all of that, but when it comes to muscle protein and exercise, is there any changes you saw in that department?
At that time, we were not comparing grass-fed and grain-fed beef or
Mm,
anything like that, or pastured eggs or conventional eggs. So there's also not a lot of data on this.
right. So
So
even now, you would not be too sure
I would
if,
not be too
right.
sure. I would have to be honest. I think the effects would be minor on from a pure muscle building standpoint. Um, I do think that. Um, some of the health benefits over time might play out over
Mm,
the long term. So, but I would say that the effects are probably going to be minor for the ability to build muscle in the short term.
right. Okay. That's no surprise, really. I just thought, just in case there was, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Uh, but no, that's fine. That's kind of what I expected. Do you have any preferred proteins for muscle? building? Like you mentioned eggs before, the whole egg, for example. Are there any other, are there any that you found were particularly good? And you mentioned protein powders and how they're handy. And do you think protein powders have a part in, getting building healthy muscle?
I mean, they could have a part, but for me personally, I use them more as when I'm on the road. I might
Mm.
consume some protein bars or some protein powders, just so for convenience, mainly because I am hungry and I like to eat all my food as much as possible, and rather than drink my calories. Although I drink a
Mm.
lot of milk because I'm Dutch, so that's kind of in our genes. But I see that more as a food source. Um, so. I would say, there's not like some magic protein source.
Right.
I would say variety is good because even if we look at the nutritional profiles of pork or chicken or eggs, and we've also profiled a good amount of quote unquote wild meats, venison, but even the other domesticated animals like lamb, like goat, they might have each of them might have somewhat different, unique nutritional profiles, especially once you start to look beyond just vitamins and minerals and protein. So I would argue variety is
Mm.
important. So I'd say that's probably the main key, is because if you eat pork, you might get more thiamine, for
Mm.
instance, vitamin B1. You might get some more vitamin B5. When you eat beef, you might get some more vitamin B3 and B12. And this is already very simple on the vitamin basis. But then if you go broader to the secondary metabolites, you get higher levels of taurine and creatine through beef, but you might get some other uh, unique metabolites or that are found higher in pork or chicken. And we also found that the antioxidants in goat and sheep and deer are higher typically than in beef because they consume more shrubs and forbs and what we consider quote unquote weeds, right? Which is sort of a mamming term for an undesirable plant, which are quite desirable for a goat and a sheep because they consume plants that maybe the cattle avoid, and they tend to consume sort of more of like the brushy type of vegetation. So they're actually about 3 or 4 times higher in these phytonutrient antioxidants, and this is probably why the flavor is a little stronger as well
Mm.
in some of those game meats or lamb and goat meat. Um, but yeah, they provide unique compounds that are not found in beef because of the way that they select their plants. So I would say try to vary your protein sources as much as possible and in a way that is enjoyable to you.
Oh, that's good because I try to have a different meat each day. I only eat beef, pork, and chicken, sometimes lamb. But when I have them all in the freezer, then I'll try to kind of have one each day, for variety, but also because, yeah, to get as many nutrients as I can. And also, I'm glad you mentioned about the protein powders that you have them as well. That's good to know because I mean, I love protein powders just to kind of pimp up one of my meals. Let's say I'm having oatmeal, then just having a scoop of protein powder makes me feel like I'm getting extra protein. I love Paleo Valley. I don't know if you know
Oh
of
yeah,
their stuff. Yeah,
yeah, of course, yeah.
the grass fed, grass finished bone broth, powders. They're so good. So I just have a couple more questions, just two more. So if I feel like I know what your answer's going to be to this, if someone could only afford one upgrade to their diet, what should it be?
Yeah, eat whole foods.
Okay, yeah,
That's the
basically
upgrade.
not the standard American diet.
Yeah, don't spend your money on. And I know it's hard because these are bigger, like because it's easy to say, and clearly as a society, it's hard to do, right? It's
Mm,
like and I think that's because of the widespread availability of ultra processed foods and the convenience of them. Um, so and it's kind of like again the widespread availability. It's easy, it's
mm,
readily obtainable, right? And therefore people would select it. So I don't think it's like people being lazy or gluttonous or anything like that, right? It's just that we're making it very hard on ourselves to eat whole foods. And me personally, when I go to the grocery store, yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna buy cookies and candy because if it's in my pantry, I will eat it. Absolutely, right? It's like the same thing as like I mean, it's not always the same thing, but if I bring drugs into my house, yeah, I'm probably gonna take the drugs, right? That's
Yeah.
just it's very very hard, right? And even though I know that the neural responses are not exactly the same, but my point, but you get my point, right? We're
Mm.
really making this hard on ourselves to in society. So I would upgrade. Well, and but then people say, well, the ultra processed foods are so tasty versus my carrot that doesn't taste like anything. So I would say try to connect directly with farmers if possible. Try to purchase from farmers. You usually get very fresh, high quality products.
Mm.
And also, and this is sort of the mental aspect of that, you feel like you're supporting another person, right? You
Yes.
feel like
Yeah.
you're supporting your own environment. And so
Mm.
get more buy-in from people as a result as well. There have been some really interesting experiments. There was a study I read on. It was a Welsh study, and they gave people sort of power of their environment, like working with farmers. But it even went so far to in like making some decisions on nature, right, and forest preservation and things such as that. And because it's in your backyard, quite literally, you get a lot of buy-in from people, right?
Mm.
And people are willing to then support some of that. And I was in Colorado the other day in Boulder, and there was really this big push of maintaining farmland within Boulder, Colorado, which is one of the most expensive cities in the US.
Mm.
People wanted to maintain farmland there and support local farmers to preserve some of that. And that's usually when you get also more buy-in from people. And so I think those are key things to do that might also help you yeah, be more, how do you say it, committed to your whole foods diet because you know you're gonna support your farmer over the next growing season. You're gonna see how your food is grown. You'll get more excited about it rather than just walking into a grocery store and get your stuff there. And sort of the impacts of growing that or the farmer behind it is super abstract. And yeah, you
Mm.
might subconsciously or not care as much.
And if somebody had a bit of money to spare at the end of the month and they thought, right, I'm going to spend it on upgrading my diet, would you say it's better to spend more on better meat, or would you say it's better to spend it on switching to organic produce?
Man, I would say if they had enough money to spend, I would say both. So
Right.
yeah, I would say both. So um, yeah, that's a very hard question. I don't
Yeah.
know if I could
Do
choose.
they the same level for you?
Yeah, to an extent they would be. Yeah, yeah. I would say to an extent they would be. It's not always the case that organic produce is more nutritious because it's a lot of it. The organic side has been watered down quite a bit, where it's
Mm.
just still grown in these incredible monocultures,
Mm.
where the main difference is that there's certain pesticides or agricultural chemicals or fertilizers that cannot be used. But what we found was in really to increase those flavonoids and other polyphenols, those flavor compounds within the crops, growing these in a more regenerative or biodiverse environment with multiple crops, with maybe organic soil amendments, with crop diversifications and rotations. That's really when you start to see these flavor compounds and these help promoting antioxidants increase in the crop. So there's no per se guarantee that if you buy organic produce that it's going to be more nutritious. If it tastes better, then probably it is.
Mm.
Um, and then the same thing I would say, and this is really interesting because we did a large beef, we call it Beef Nutrient Density Project, which was done with the Bionutrient Institute, a nonprofit, farmer led nonprofit organization. And we profiled a lot of sort of the North American supply chain. And some of the grass fed beef that you bought in the grocery store, some of it was very high quality,
Yeah.
but some of it was also very questionable. And we were wondering,
Mm.
like, I don't know if this is grass fed beef, or if it is, it's really poor quality. So it was a real hit or miss. So again, I would say at the moment, the best way to get high quality products might be to source this from local farmers. Although certainly various grocery store chains now are starting to maybe gets more certification or starting to look at their supply chain because they see the field of regenerative agriculture coming up and obviously want to capture that or retain that audience that cares a lot about the quality and the taste of their food. So
Mm.
um, so I would not I don't know if I can choose between
Right. So both, if possible.
both possible.
I
Yeah.
hear you. Okay. Well, that was such a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much. How can people follow what you do?
So my website's stephanvanvliet.com. Our Google Scholar profile, or my Google Scholar profile, if you just type in Google Scholar Stephan van Vliet, you'll find the actual studies. And we always try to publish the studies open access so that and anyone can read them. They may be a little bit technical at times, but now you can just upload it to ChatGPT or Gemini, and it can probably
Mm.
give you a
Yeah.
pretty good interpretation of it. And then, yeah, I try to do a lot of podcasts. I give webinars. So if you type in my name on YouTube, you can probably find some of the things that we talked about today,
Yeah.
but actually some graphs behind it and visuals. So that could be an easy way to reach me. And I think I'm pretty easy to find online. So if people have any more questions, sending me an email
Mm.
is always great as well.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Stefan. That was fabulous.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.